So good afternoon, good morning, good day. Welcome to today's CEOS Cultural Economics online seminar, which is a part of the communication activities of the Association for Cultural Economics International. I'm Elisabetta Lazzaro, the CEOS coordinator, professor of creative and cultural industries at the Business School for the Creative Industries at the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. Today's seminar is on lockdown and cultural consumption in the UK, comparing data and methodological approaches. We will have four presenters, Tal Feder, Dave O'Brien, Salvatore Di Novo, and Giorgio Fazio, respectively two sociologists and two economists, analyzing the very same, a very big issue that is the cultural participation affected by the lockdown here in the UK and the effects. But we will see that apart from disciplinary perspectives, we can tackle a major issue with different research questions, with different data, different analysis, and therefore possible different findings. So we will start with the sociologists. So with Tal Feder and Dave O'Brien. Tal Feder is a sociologist, postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. Dave O'Brien is a professor of cultural creative industries at the University of Sheffield. With CEO Bud McAndrew and Mark Taylor, Tal and Dave recently published in Leisure Studies the paper Cultural Consumption and COVID-19, Evidence from the Taking Part and COVID-19 Cultural Participation Monitor Surveys in 2022. Tal and Dave presentation will be followed by the presentation by Salvatore Di Novo and Giorgio Fazio. Salvatore is an applied economist, postdoctoral researcher at Newcastle University and part of the AHRC-funded Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center. Giorgio Fazio is also an applied economist, chair of macroeconomics and leader of the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center, which deals with on internationalization of the creative industries from Newcastle University. Together with Hasan Bakhshi, Nesta, Salvatore and Giorgio recently published in the Journal of Cultural Economics the paper The Great Lockdown and Cultural Consumption in the UK. 2022. So Tal and Dave, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so I guess you see my screen now.
Yes.
And I want to just start with thanking you, Elisabetta and ACI for the invite. We're very happy to be here. I'll present the paper that Dave and I co-authored with Siobhan McAndrew and Mark Taylor, and which is actually a part of a bigger research project with other colleagues that is available the report, Culture in Crisis, and soon in a more detailed book. So a little promo here, and I'll start with the presentation itself. So we know that culture is a central axis of social stratification systems, and that culture reflects, structures, and reproduces social inequalities. And we see those inequalities also in culture and leisure activities. So what happened then when COVID-19 struck and disrupted the traditional means of cultural consumption, when much of the cultural production and consumption pivoted online and in-house, and many people found themselves confined in their homes with more leisure time than they used to have, at least at the beginning. Did that make cultural consumption more accessible? Did it trigger a transformation in the stratification of cultural participation? Some, like these cultural icons, thought that the pandemic could have an equalizing effect, erasing social differences, but we beg to differ, let's say, as we will show in this paper, at least in the UK context. So I don't know if the background is really necessary here, but just, of course, in the UK, like most elsewhere, the pandemic had a devastating effect on society, and particularly on arts organizations, on artists. Government in the UK stood up with some rescue funding to keep arts organization heads above water, and also to uplift the spirits of the people during the phases of lockdown. And many arts organizations really answered this call with online supply of cultural contents from big organizations like the National Theatre, Streaming Theatre, or small organizations really reaching out to the local communities via online measures, let's say. At that time, one narrative that came up that was really strong, we can call it digital optimism, asserted that the pandemic is actually doing some good to the art world and simply accelerating a development of the arts industries towards a digital future that was destined to come anyway, sooner or later. When we first wrote these papers, there was already quite an extensive literature, and today there's even more literature about the effect of pandemic on cultural labor, on cultural production, but less so on cultural consumption. And here we wanted to contribute to this question. So we present here a comparative analysis of two nationally representative surveys in the UK that study cultural and leisure activities, mostly activities that were available both before and after and during actually the pandemic. And using this data, we show that the cultural consumption moved online. When it moved online and in home, there was no really discernible transformation in the stratification of cultural participation. This I will not go over it at all, but just to acknowledge that we rely here on two bodies of literature. One, the big extensive literature about cultural consumption that seeks to measure consumption and to find the determinants of cultural engagement and participation. And the other literature, more recent, that looks at the impact of the digital means of production and dissemination of culture and cultural activities on their consumption. So our research question here was actually, what was the change, if at all, in cultural consumption patterns in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and who changed their consumption in what way? We can think of two hypothetical contrasting answers here. One is that people exploited their additional availability of culture online and the newly opened opportunities of cultural participation and leisure activity and enhanced their activity, whether digital or not. The other option is that actually, like some studies before the pandemic shows, that leisure activities really, we see like a replication of inequality patterns in the offline cultural world, the replication of this same inequality patterns from the offline cultural world to the online cultural world. And we'll see that those who benefit from the new offering will be maybe mostly those already active before. Also, there's an option that online fatigue and increased external constraints aggravated by the pandemic may also lead people to even reduce their cultural and leisure activity. Okay, so let's go a bit deeper into the methods. So we used here in this research two different data sources. For lack of time, I will concentrate here mostly on the first one. One is the Taking Part web panel, specifically, which is part of the bigger Taking Part survey conducted by the DCMS, the UK Ministry of Culture, which was, they had this special Taking Part web panel during the COVID-19 pandemic in May, June, July 2020. And we have here over 2,000 respondents who were asked about 41 cultural and leisure activities. The other data source is another survey done by an organization called the Audience Agency. They conducted this cultural participation monitor in several waves during the pandemic, actually almost until recently. Here we look at one specific wave, which also has about 1,500 respondents. And there's some differences in the questions asked by both surveys, but actually they're doing the same kind of questions, asking people about changes in their engagement with different arts and leisure activities, and whether they were spending and engaging and spending more, less, the same time with those activities, comparing before the pandemic and during the pandemic, or whether they never do it, not then and not now. The analysis of each data source was in 3 steps. The first was cluster analysis. We had many cultural and leisure activity items, many of them closely related to each other, like watching TV on demand, watching TV streaming, reading a book, reading an e-book. So we wanted to reduce the dimensionality of the data and look for groups or families of related activities, as is often done in cultural consumption research. We used here hierarchical cluster analysis for our data, which is a categorical and ordered data, less, more, the same, not at all. And we chose the number of clusters according to the RAND index. The second step was, after reducing the number of activities to a small number of group of activities, was looking for groups of respondents that share the same patterns of change in their cultural consumption. We wanted to describe general patterns of change in a more parsimonious way. So we used latent class analysis, which is also another common way in the sociological literature to analyze cultural consumption patterns and distinguish between groups of consumers who share the same patterns of consumption. Here we decided on the number of clusters using various indices like the Bayesian criteria, Kaike infrastructure criteria, likelihood ratio, entropy, and so forth. And the third and last step was, after we grouped the respondents to several groups, was running a multinomial regression, where the dependent variable was a variable of belonging to a specific group of consumers, and the independent variables were different individual characteristics. We were looking actually of the propensity of belonging to a certain cluster depend on people's individual characteristics. Okay, so I go very fast on this. We found 9, I'll again concentrate here on the taking part data. We found 9 clusters of activities: TV watching, outdoor activities, media reading and listening, sports watching, online art and performance, exercising, video games, online heritage and library engagement, and other like creative activities people doing themselves. Here we are looking already at the results of the latent class analysis. When we mapped the groups that we found in the latent class analysis in the taking part survey, we found 4 groups of consumers, and they mapped actually in a very clear picture. When we found that the identity of these 4 groups is as following: the biggest group of people in the latent class analysis was people who did not engage with these cultural activities at all, not before, not during the pandemic. These were about 63% of the respondents in our survey. A smaller group was characterized by maintaining a similar level of cultural consumption pre and during the pandemic. We call them the resilients. They were about 18% of the sample. Another group were people who increased their consumption during the pandemic. We called them the enhancers. There were 16% of the survey, and a 4th smaller group that did less cultural and leisure activity during the pandemic. We called them the reducers, and were 5% of the sample. What we see here in this picture actually is likelihood of each of these groups to change their activity in each of the groups of activities. And we see in a gray, these are people who more likely to never do specific activity, not before or not during the pandemic. Blue, people who reduce, like more likely to reduce their time spent of this activity. Red, about the same, and yellow, more time enhancing their activity. Elisabetta, how much time do I have left? Just tell me. I was
3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Okay. So to go on it very fast, we see that, for example, everybody is watching TV. We see here that actually there's almost no gray color. Most people, this was like the go-to activities people really increased and did the most. But actually many people just retain the same level of TV watching, not increasing it too much. There were also, here, of course, quite obviously outdoor activity was reduced the most, and media reading and listening was mostly seen. We saw that our enhancers group increased the media consumption reading, but for the other groups, it's mostly doing the same or less, or not at all, rather than increasing. For all the other activity clusters, the predominant color is gray, meaning people were not doing these activities, not at all, not before, not during the pandemic. And except for our enhancer groups, it's mostly either engaging with these activities with just the same frequency as before the pandemic, or even less, both for the more elitist and more popular forms of culture. I will not go in details on all the details, just now to show some results from the regression. So this is a set. We had a limited set of independent variables in our data, but here is a set of independent variables for taking parts in the audience agency data. And I will also not show here the regression table itself, but like I will highlight the most important findings in the comparison of who is more likely to belong to this group of enhancers, reducers, resilience, or non-engagers. So we found, for example, that women were more generally likely to increase their cultural consumption during the pandemic, which is in line with what we know about gender differences in the cultural consumptions. Elsewhere, we saw that ethnic minorities were more likely to reduce their cultural consumption. Parents, they didn't have to go to find a babysitter to go out of home to see a cultural event, but because they were themselves the babysitters, and we see that parents are more likely to reduce their cultural consumption and other leisure activities compared to the pre-pandemic period. Age had an interesting effect. All the respondents were more likely to be resilient, not affected too much by the pandemic in their cultural consumption, but also not exploiting the new opportunities. Young consumers were more likely to be either enhancers, but also reducers, meaning they were more likely to change their consumption patterns, but not necessarily to increase it. So just to quickly conclude and wrap up what we found, we saw that the prevalence of low and non-engagement with cultural consumption and leisure activities was mostly not altered by the pandemic. We still see a very large portion of the population who do not engage with cultural activities the way they are measured here. We haven't seen a revolution happening in cultural activity due to the pandemic. A significant part of the population was able to retain the level of cultural consumption and leisure activity, but at the same time, many people did not exploit the new access opportunities. Increase and diversification of cultural consumption was mostly associated with younger age groups and individuals that found themselves with more extra free time, and external constraints like work and parenting reduced chances of increasing cultural activity. Last slide, we can say that basically we see that the pandemic was not this wormhole that you enter in one side and come out of on the other side 20 years ahead in the evolution of the cultural consumption and participation towards the digital bright future. Mostly offline patterns of inequality continued into the predominantly digital cultural world of the pandemic, and inequalities associated with gender, race, age are still influential. So we can say that it seems that the pandemic has not disrupted the arts audiences in the same way it disrupted arts production, whether in terms of bringing a new significant engagement with arts or changing the key demographics of existing consumers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perfect timing. Now let's switch to the second presentation to be followed by the discussion with the rest of the audience.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Elisabetta. Thanks for inviting me and giving the chance to present. Thanks to the audience, and also thanks to Tal, because perhaps he already gave some background that I can go quicker with. So as Elisabetta told at the very beginning, this paper is a co-author paper with the Hasan Bakhshi and George Pazzi, which is here. And his name, it was recently published in the Journal of Cultural Economics, and the title is about the Great Lockdown and Cultural Consumption in the UK, and it's quite self-explanatory perhaps. So, and I will begin with some motivation, and here is just a timeline that I covered from The Guardian about telling about the various steps where all of this of the pandemic began. And from the very first case detected in China and the start and alarms from the World Health Organization up to the first lockdown, the first government-induced closure and restriction to physical movement taking place at the end of February 2020 in Novo, and which leads essentially to what is our key focus of our analysis, which relates to the effect that state-imposed restriction on physical movement implied for the overall economy and for the cultural and creativity sector in particular. And in fact, we know that venues were forced to shut down. There was unprecedented shock for the sector. Individuals had to stay home with the associated sudden and abrupt changes in their lives involving working patterns, income, and the availability of time indeed. So as already quite well said, eventually there was a huge shift to digital in relation to all the possible aspects of life that could move to digital, and clearly the consumption of creative and cultural content was one such prominent example. And again, as already anticipated, as already mentioned widely by Tal before, there is an existing literature that has widely investigated various dimensions that could explain the patterns of cultural consumption. And indeed, it was also another starting point that motivated our research, because we wanted to see how much of this pattern, how many of this pattern were about to keep maintaining throughout let's say a different way to approach, consume, and engage with culture and creativity. We know that there is there are socioeconomic status and uneven patterns are dominant features of consumption of cultural and creative contents, as well as we know that the importance of gender-related differences, as well as the different patterns that characterize interaction within the household, age pattern, and so on and so forth. On top of that, as briefly mentioned before, COVID-19 implied sudden changes on income, in labor participation, in time use, time availability, and so on. And we are, as Tal and Dave and co-authors, alongside few other contributions, among those that try to investigate what happened to the demand for cultural and creative contents in this context. So, and specifically, just to stress that the focus of this study is on the shift in consumption of cultural and creative contents as a result following from the introduction of the first national lockdown in the UK, which was effective from the 31st March of 2020. And we have investigated essentially content by content changes in the types of content that we were allowed to observe, as well as the overall pattern of consumption that it will become clear in a short while. But at the same time, we also wanted to see how these changes had a were differently channeled across individuals based on their socioeconomic characteristics. And we also thought that eventually this kind of the type of cultural and creative contents we are considering here and the remote nature of their consumption, eventually it has also been less widely investigated so far. So this could be another contribution from this paper. So the data we use, this is our first source of data. So another one exploring the topic is an online survey of UK individuals aged 16 years and older. That was carried out at the stem from the collaboration between the UK Intellectual Property Office and the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center and AudienceNet. And through the survey, we are able to observe online consumption of 6-7 distinct contents, which are music, movies, TV, games, books, magazine, and audiobooks. And crucially, we are able through the survey to identify consumption, self-reported consumption happening in the 3 months that led to the prior to the introduction of the shelter-in-place measures, and in the few months that are immediately following from the introduction of the shelter-in-place measures. And alongside that, we could also observe a wide range of socioeconomic characteristics of the individuals interviewed. So the contents, and how do we measure that? Essentially, for the 7 kind of contents that I just mentioned, we could observe whether those individuals were consuming each type of the content either through downloads, online access, or from online purchase of each of the content. By this observation, we were able to derive binary indicators tracking whether individuals were in any of these manners consuming each of the contents. And then simply we also constructed a composite indicator just stemming from the summation of all of these binary indicators tracking our measure of consumption variety, or if you prefer overall consumption. And just checking, okay, the chart. So here are some of the preliminary evidence that we could draw. We could see that there are differences in the popularity across the content consumed, as well as we can observe a general increase in the share of individuals consuming music. The more popular, I would say, contents like music, movies, and TV programs. While we observe, according to the manner we could measure that, so we could measure consumption, we observed some sort of a 20% decline in the consumption of books, and a slight increase in games and scene consumptions. So, and overall, this resulted in a rightward shift in the overall consumption pattern of individuals, which mostly seems to have featured the individual line in the left tail of the distribution. So there was, it seems to be, put another way, seems to be something mostly pertaining to individuals who were on very low level of remote consumption of cultural and creative contents. And after this, I moved to the empirical, I mean, this was just a starting point that motivated our empirical analysis, where we wanted to assess our purpose was twofold, at least. First, to have to get an overall sense of the increase, if any, of the change in consumption of cultural and creative contents, and this is done by equation number 1, where our coefficient of interest is the indicator variable named POST, which just tracks the average increase in the level, the average change, and in the likelihood of individuals to consume cultural and creative contents. While in equation 2, our purpose was to assess how any of the socioeconomic characteristics that we could observe had let's say, brought about changes that were specific to that particular type of characteristic, and it will be clearer in a while. And again, as with both question 1 and question 2, we could control for the various range of socioeconomic demographic characteristics as well as other contextual factors. And here I go with the results, where to start with, the upper panel of the table, we report the results from where our primary interest is in the average change in the likelihood of consuming any of the contents or in the overall consumption. So essentially, these are results from logit regressions, and the coefficients, the exponential coefficients that are reported means that a coefficient greater than 1 denotes an increase in the odds of consuming, and following from this multivariate regression, what we observed that eventually, overall, on average, the likelihood of increasing of the likelihood of consuming music and games only went up, following from the introduction of a shelter-in-place measure, while we found that the odds of consuming books kind of essentially halved, following from the same measure. With no change recorded after controlling for all of the set of socioeconomic characteristics recorded for the other types of cultural and creative contents. Overall, however, we could record a slight increase in consumption pattern for individuals related to the overall basket of contents we could observe. And regarding the set of controls that we could include into our multivariate regression, and most importantly those that we were primarily interested in, we could observe that in general we could see that individuals on unemployment were more likely to consume TV programs. There was a general tendency of individuals on employment individual unemployment, as well as household socioeconomic standing, women and older individuals to consume books, and these were variously tracked across the other types of contents, as well as on the overall consumption patterns. But since then, we wanted to see whether these socioeconomic characteristics could have an effect, could shape asymmetrically consumption pattern following from the introduction of shelter-in-place measure. And that's what we did with this set of other regressions that were essentially interacting our indicator for the tracking the lockdown, the period where shelter-in-place measures were in place, with any of the socioeconomic characteristics we could observe in turn, which means that we were running these regressions interacting the post indicator with that dimension tracking occupational status, and then with the dimension tracking living condition, and so on and so forth. So eventually, what we could see that we could see that the effect was quite the same across the various socioeconomic characteristics, be that actually tracking a change, or be that not tracking a change in the likelihood of consuming. There was just few cases where we could observe an asymmetric change in the likelihood of consuming, and these are just denoted by the red color coefficients. And this could be that in the case of occupational status, we could see that individuals on either unemployment or who were on retirement were more likely, significantly more likely, to increase gains consumption only. And while in the other case, although we find that some categories are associated with an increase or a change in the likelihood of consuming, when we test for differences across these coefficients, we find that these differences are rarely statistically different from each other. These coefficients are rarely statistically different from each other. And then we focus on another set of socioeconomic characteristics that we deem to be interested in. In particular, we find that eventually quite interesting result in relation to household socioeconomic status, which is an indicator variable that we built based on information on the main household earner income and social grade based on the National Readership Survey. And what we find is that eventually it looked like mainly there was no, let's say, further widening of existing inequality across the based on socioeconomic conditions. And indeed, we also find that individuals on the bottom part of the social ladder, if you allow me to call it like that, were either more likely to increase their consumption on games, which is something quite interesting as far as this type of category also involves having some sort of infrastructure available. And at the same time, despite the generalized reduction that we found to happen on book consumption, they were also less likely to reduce their book consumption. On the other hand, we found also statistically significant differences related to age in the consumption of games and books, and again, pretty much mimicking what we found before in relation to unemployed individuals. We find that individuals on retirement. We found that individuals on the very top quartile of the age distribution were way more likely to consume games during the lockdown and way more likely also to reduce the consumption of books. These results widely
I'm
also...
sorry, Salvatore, if you could
Yes,
come to the
I'm there.
Thank you.
I'm there. Thank you, Elisabetta. The results broadly hold whenever we also investigated overall consumption pattern, which leads me to the conclusion. So, to sum up, what we found was that the effect of the introduction of the fact that individuals were constrained in staying in their home, essentially in focusing on cultural and creative contents, resulted in changes in consumption that were very much content specific. Music and games, for instance, the consumption of music and games went up, and the opposite happened for books. While overall we found an increase in the overall in the basket consumed of cultural and creative contents. If we stay aside from lockdown specific changes, access or consumption of cultural and creative contents is still characterized by more or less the same kind of a pattern, the same kind of dynamics, the same kind of characteristics that seems to be relevant in order to explain the consumption of cultural and creative contents. Whenever we instead investigated the dimension, which dimensions and the extent socioeconomic characteristics could affect the consumption, the changes during lockdown, we found barely the effect of asymmetries taking place in consumption pattern, which whether on one side, as Tal mentioned before, to stress that these persistent differences are still there. One concern could be that those characteristics, those differences could widen during lockdown, and if anything, it didn't seem to be the case according to our analysis. And we also found some moderate evidence that there could be some sign of reduction. And again, that pertains mostly to individuals who were on the older individuals perhaps pertaining to the lower to the left tail of the socioeconomic standing in society. And that's all from me, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Salvatore and Giorgio, for this also very interesting presentation. So apparently, controversial results for the three social categories that dispose of relatively more free time, namely young people, retired, and unemployed. But I would like to open the floor to our audience if you have any questions or comments, and perhaps later on we can debate on these apparently controversial results. So let the audience think about possible comments and questions. Could you please elaborate on these rather apparently different results you came up with about the different social strata of the population in the UK and how they reacted during and also after the lockdown, and possibly if there were any persistence effects in the sense of continuing effects after the lockdown, if we are allowed to speak about a post-lockdown era, hopefully, or different effects taking place after the very crucial phase of the great lockdown.
Before we started, Tal had made some really excellent points about the timing of data collection, and it'd be perfect to hear those, because if we cast our minds back, the vibe in March, April, May of 2020, when things were incredibly uncertain, was distinctively different to the end of summer, and then different again as we got into 21.
Recapitulate what Dave says, that if we look at the time of the survey, we see that the first survey that we use, the taking part survey, was conducted just after Salvatore's and Giorgio's survey was already collected, and the other survey that we use of the audience agency was actually collected during February 2021, and actually, the audience agency has been collecting since then other additional waves of the survey, and we see actually these really trends. Of course, the pandemic was a big shock. It changed things, disrupted things, but we see the correction and actually the regression to the mean. We see that this going back to normal as in each additional wave of the survey. And I think that my take on this, I don't have maybe the actual, the most, the best results to really support this claim. I think that what we've seen in the changes in the pandemic were mostly due to increased access related to time. People had more time. They were able to use this time to do more leisure activities and maybe to widen somewhat the variety of leisure activities. But as things were somehow getting back to some kind of normal, and people were going back to work remotely or going back to work in the office, so little by little this increased access of time, this effect was diminished, and we are left with the fact that maybe one of the biggest access barriers to culture is the cultural, the educational, the taste, the habitus, which really somehow shapes people's cultural activity, and this was not altered by the pandemic. So when time barrier came back again, we saw that the changes were not really long-term changes in cultural consumption.
I think Giorgio has a comment, and then Andrei, and then Jen added a comment in the chat, please.
Yes, thank you, Elisabetta. Thank you, Tal, and Salvatore, of course. So I just wanted to point to some differences in the way on how the two studies are constructed. There are, and my impression is that we came from slightly different angles, not only because we come from different disciplines. Of course, we want to integrate the two as much as possible in order to address issues in cultural economics, but also in terms of data and the structure of the data. It occurs to me that when we looked at this, and I remember, I think this was very much thanks to the agility of the Policy Intelligence Center. When this occurred, we immediately went into data collection mode, thanks to this extension of the IPO-OCI survey. And I remember at the time we sat down, we started extending the questionnaire so we could monitor consumption of cultural and creative content immediately after the introduction of the lockdown measures. And that's why when we then use this portion of the data, there is additional data that looks after removal of the first wave, first lockdown, where there are also differences in terms of stringency and territoriality, but we don't use that data in this work. In this work, we concentrate on this first part of the data, and was really about comparing consumption across, within individuals, right? What were individuals doing? So a key features of our data is that our data is longitudinal. So we observe the same individuals in different waves. So we don't pool individuals and in a way make them indistinct. It's pre and post that I think distinguishes what we're trying to do here with respect to the same individuals, and therefore the way the effect of lockdown impacts on consumption depending on the characteristics of individuals, those characteristics that we can extract from the literature as important, and also in terms of the how lockdown may have affected individuals. And also in terms of time, we have to remember that this was we called it the gray lockdown because it was the most stringent of lockdowns in the UK. Whereas subsequent lockdowns were probably less stringent. So the focus of our work was really on the impact of lockdown. And we do notice a lot of persistence, of course, together with some changes. Also, a key distinction is that we do look at different contents. So our focus was really on different contents and looking at heterogeneity across contents. And of course, we then bumped into this literature on highbrow versus lowbrow activities, and we were trying to reconcile our finding with the extant literature which is mostly coming from sociology within cultural economics. So I think this is a key I think difference between what we've done and what we wanted to do, and of course what the other paper does, which works with different data and slightly different hypotheses coming from a different angle. So I think all in all, the two papers complement each other a lot. Probably what Dave Tull and others paper does can say also something more about the longer term effects, not just within lockdown, but also beyond the lockdown, for example, which is a critical question. At the time, we were taking part in a lot of panels discussing the long-term effects. But I will just say something else, and then I'll probably shut up for the moment. But in thinking about all this, we need to remember that that we can discuss all this because of the availability of technology. Right? When the Spanish flu hit us well, we weren't there at the time, but in 1918, 1920, there was no technology that would allow consumption of culture and creative content. Theaters stayed open very often, and the situation was fundamentally different. So if we do not observe drastic changes in the way people consume, is also because there is technology available. So the what if is, if we didn't have technology, would we have observed the same persistence or not? I think that is one question that is interesting to address, extrapolating from our results, probably.
Thank you, Giorgio. I think there is a question from Andrei.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentations. It was very nice to listen. So few questions I would have. Firstly, one for Tal and the first presentation. Basically, you used two different, I would say, in general, clustering methods in two different places. What drove the choice of the two different approaches? Could just I don't know, hierarchical clustering not be appropriate for both, or LCA? So what drove those differences in usage of the different methods? And for the second presentation, basically a few questions. Firstly, just a pure content one. I'm just interested, I didn't go naturally into research on those issues, but why those differences between different cultural products? Why are games rising? Why are books declining? Or is there any special, and the others with insignificant effects? Is there any special reason why during the pandemic some would rise and some lower, maybe even some elasticities or something? And secondly, based that you analyze the effect of the lockdown, which is usually analyzed also in causal manner, could this study in any way be translated into causality, this post treatment, I would say post variable? I think I might be wrong in the second equation. There was a post variable missing, but maybe I'm wrong. There were only the interaction and the Z term. But in general, could this causality in any way in this survey be estimated? Thanks. That's enough from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. So,
okay, maybe I let Salvatore and Giorgio start. Did they catch you?
Salvatore, I can also see your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, I raised my hand because I want to stress. I wanted to stress one more point, and then I'll also try to answer a Jen question. But yeah, I will start from Andrei's point. And I mean, I take the last part of his question was related to our paper. If I'm wrong, just please correct me. Yes, I mean, our attempt was that one, bearing in mind that clearly having complete control of all the factors that were changing it is a bit hard, if not out of the scope. Because what we've done, I mean, I'm happy to share more details, but what we've done essentially is just to, I mean, I believe that our average treatment for the post, although conveys a number of different channels that could explain the change in consumption, if anything, so it's very much blurred in terms of the underlying mechanism, but it's very clean and very net in what it is. So from that point of view, I think it's an advantage of having that one compared to a simple pre-post characteristics in a multivariate regression that keep tracks of a number of relevant factors. As far as the purpose was to investigate the various socioeconomic characteristics, I agree that again limitations are in there, for instance, considering the high level of correlation between the various socio-demographics, and clearly this is something we've done with reassuring results. But one thing that we tried, but we understand it was a bit cumbersome, was to come up with a full vector of interaction between the post indicator and all of the social demographics. But again, this would imply a lot of a high chance of losing power. So I think this was a good compromise we could come out in order to get a good understanding of the results. And I hope that I answer your question with that. And if I can briefly add on one more point to stress one, I think, relevant character difference from the study, because perhaps I wasn't good enough to stress this, but we just focused by relying on these indicator for participation for a binary consumption decision. We didn't track consumption intensity. And this is an important point to realize in two respects. First, clearly, the intensity of consumption could be completely different, and actually be completely different patterns than participation decision. And indeed, we could see our results perhaps as lower bound, and that they are also important in the sense that if participation to an access and consumption of cultural and creative contents widened, this should be interpreted as a very good results and potentially promising results as long as this is about to be sustained over time, because this would imply a large cohorts of individual accessing this type of contents. And yeah. And the very last point to try to address partially what Jen asked is about the digital means. Well, I had to retrieve the question, sorry, because I forgot in the meantime what it was about. Yeah, essentially one point about the so-called digital divide. Well, first I could say that this is part of another work we are trying to come out with, more precisely addressing the question. Secondly, I think that most of the contents we analyzed were, at least in principle, while featuring subscription and cost of access, they were either generally or because of the moments, as you recall, there were a lot of free to view offers during at the time. In principle, I think they feature cost of access and to a minor extent. And on top of that, the survey was carried out online, meaning that all individuals asked the questions were able to had an internet connection and could, in principle, access internet and digital means. So this was less of a concern, if that answers your question.
May I just shortly intervene? What about these differences between different products, games, books, and so on, and magazines, and so on? Is there any content explanation on the results?
Well, I mean, part of the explanation we do have, again, I am tempted to attribute to a large participation. For instance, when we focus on the results, which are quite robust on games, and the fact that the older cohorts and individuals similarly started consuming games, this seems to be, and again, consuming and to be meant in a participation, non-participation manner. This seems to be most of a result of increased time availability, individuals having to find alternatives to spend their time, individuals, and those are individuals also that more likely were less likely to consume to consume that type of contents beforehand, and this could be one crucial reason explaining that result for that type of group.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And I would like also to mention the comment and the question raised by Jen Noble in the chat. So about the declining household incomes and the digital divide, that is to what extent households with less resources could afford possibly higher access and consumption of media. And thank you, Dave, for referring to another paper on such a dramatic phenomenon of the Great Lockdown in the UK by Ken Roberts, University of Liverpool, who found, among others, that actually there was a general increase of media consumption, at least in this country. And I would like to make a sort of provocative question, because out of 4 authors here are original from countries other than the UK, so namely Italy and Israel. So to what extent could we possibly generalize these findings to your countries, to our countries? Have you got any thought to this respect or not?
I think Dave was to say something, so his hand is up. So
please, Dave, go ahead. Thank you, Giorgio.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to pick up on Jen's question actually, and sort of make a slightly left field point. So Mark Taylor, who's one of the other authors of this paper, Peter Campbell and I, a while ago now, maybe sort of 4 or 5 years ago, wrote a paper looking at kind of cultural consumption by profession, and we found arts and cultural practitioners are the kind of heaviest users of cultural products by profession. And it strikes me actually what Jen, your point. So we had a furlough scheme, an income protection scheme in the UK, and the people that were least likely to benefit from it were freelancers. And we know that arts and cultural practitioners are the most freelance. And obviously this is a relatively small number of workers when you're looking at, a nationally representative survey of 1,000 people or 1,500 or 2,000 people. But it strikes me that one of the kind of the big sort of income struggles for cultural consumption would be precisely with the group that is most likely to be a high consumer already, because we know cultural workers were likely to be freelance, when fared very poorly with income support schemes. There was quite a depressing story about a folk musician in the news in the UK this week who lost both touring income and had no protection from the furlough scheme as well for sort of various reasons. So it might be interesting to think about some work that looks at the kind of almost sort of cultural consumers and cultural producers together, and patterns of sort of change there, whereby they're given this sort of huge cornucopia of digital possibilities, but at the same time their stress levels go through the roof because they're really worried about their income, and anything that requires money is sort of impossible for them. So I think there's a very interesting kind of almost a sub project there to be done about precisely the kind of heaviest users who are perhaps least likely to be protected by government intervention.
Thank you, Dave. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end and we have to stop here. But I would like to thank very much our presenters of today, Tal Feder, Dave O'Brien, Salvatore Di Novo, and Giorgio Fazio. It was so enriching to have different disciplines, sociology and economics, to really dialogue with each other around such an important phenomenon for research and also practice and policy interests. And I would like also to thank the audience for such interesting questions and comments, and invite you to the next Cultural Economics online seminar, which will be very global. So it will be on Tuesday, the 14th of February, St. Valentine's Day. It will be very global because we will have presenters from the United States, Korea, Australia, and India, and I will be in the middle. So sorry for the time of next CEOS, so that it will be 5 a.m. GMT, so a big effort. But if you cannot attend, please be advised that you have always the opportunity to watch our seminars on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much again. By the way, I forgot to announce the title of the next CEOS, that will be Social Values in Cultural Entrepreneurship, Theory and Practice. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.